I'm Gary Bembridge. This is another of my Tips for Travellers cruising updates. There is an enormous wave, a torrent of developments and activities that are happening, and things are really accelerating in the world of cruising. So I want to talk about four really significant groups of developments and news that have happened over the last week when it comes to cruising. First of all, we're seeing an acceleration in the rate that cruising is resuming. However, this really depends on where you're based in the world. The news coming out of the United States is less promising. By the time you watch this, you're likely to see the CDC extending their no sail order, which is due to expire on the 24th of July. The key issue is how long that is going to be extended for. Most of the reports at the moment are suggesting that could be as far as November or even beyond, for two reasons, one of which the growing rate of infections that we're seeing reported across the United States. So until that comes down, they're unlikely to make an indication of a move to resumption of cruising. And secondly, of course, you have the elections coming up in November. So from a political perspective, the feeling is there is a lot of pressure to basically keep cruising, if you excuse the pun, at bay. So certainly in the US, not good news. However, we're seeing around the world cruising slowly resuming and accelerating resuming as infection rates fall. For example, we've seen in Norway, we've had cruising for some time with Hurtigruten and Sea Dream. That is now opening to travellers not just from Norway and Denmark, but for travellers across the EU with the exception of Sweden. Germany is starting to sail with big ships again for German, Austrian and Swiss residents initially only. We're seeing Carnival's AIDA sailing. We're seeing Royal Caribbean groups Mein Schiff and Hapag Lloyd sailing. These are ships that normally hold between 2,000 and 4,000 passengers. In France, Ponant are now sailing for French citizens around a series of French ports. Iceland has opened to expedition cruising, and we're seeing two cruise lines, Hurtigruten and also Ponant, heading up there to start sailing. We're also seeing in Svalbard expedition cruises going. And importantly, in the UK, Hurtigruten have announced some round UK cruises, and very significantly, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office updated their cruising advice to talk about ocean cruising only, so river cruising. UK residents can now go river cruising in Europe, which is open. And also they, very importantly in their update, talk about international ocean cruising, strongly suggesting that those round the UK cruises are likely to start. As I mentioned, Hurtigruten have already announced them, and there's lots of expectation that over the coming weeks we will see more and more UK-based cruise lines offering round UK for UK residents. So definitely what we're seeing is regional cruising starting up for regional passengers only initially, according to one country destinations. That's very important. What we're seeing with all of these cruises, they are only traveling to one country. They're not moving internationally across borders. Of course, as these cruises open up, that of course again excludes US residents, which are not allowed to fly into the EU or the UK without going through a period of quarantine. The second really important piece of news is kind of a link to that, which is around cruising doesn't look like it's starting with international travel anytime soon, i.e. moving between countries. It's sticking within one key country. And we're seeing lots of restrictions still building when it comes to ports. So we've seen, for example, Bar Harbor in Canada having a vote around small cruising, which could have started up, and they have excluded cruise ships for the whole year. Key West is also voting whether the large cruise ships are going to be allowed to come into Key West, and they're doing a vote on that in November when the elections are happening in the US in November. Of course, we've already seen Australia excluding cruise ships through third quarter, Canada excluding cruise ships. But what we're absolutely seeing is the movement of cruise ships between countries is really still being locked down. This is again not great news for US residents, because the Caribbean is not opening up to travelers in a particularly big way. And when they're opening up, they're requiring, in many cases, COVID-19 tests. So for example, Bahamas, St. Martin, St. Lucia, all big cruise ports. Even if you're coming in as a land-based traveler, you have to have a COVID-19 test certificate. So we're still seeing lots of barriers to cruise ships building as these ports open up again. So certainly international cruising does not seem to be on the cards. And that's one of the big things I've taken from all the news over the last week, and certainly over the last 2 weeks, is local cruising with local passengers or one country focused cruising seems to be the way forward, certainly for much of 2020. The third is around consolidation, contraction of the cruise industry. We're seeing, for example, cruise lines reducing their capacity. So Carnival has been the most aggressive so far, getting rid of 13 ships. They sold one of the UK P&O ships. Most recently, certainly it happened within 24 hours before I recorded this, is Holland America have got rid of 30%, 4 of 14 of their ships within their fleet. So they have sold off 4 of their ships, which are the Maasdam, the Veendam, the Rotterdam and the Amsterdam. 2 of those ships have been bought by Fred Olsen in the UK, and they're going to take 2 of their ships out of service and replace them with those 2 ships. So we're definitely seeing consolidation. We're also seeing Royal Caribbean have bought out the part of Silversea they didn't own, so that's now wholly percent operating cruise line within their portfolio. They've also let Pullman Tour go, which was their joint venture that they had in Spain, and those ships that were in their fleets are basically being scrapped. We're also seeing with new ships, those are being delayed partly because of the restrictions with the shipbuilding yards not being able to build them as fast because of the disruption because of COVID-19, but certainly trying to bring on new capacity in a much slower fashion. So we are seeing a contraction in size of the cruise industry and number of ships. And they've already indicated that when ships do start sailing again, it's going to be in a slow way as they start to release capacity to try and match demand and of course try and, I guess, keep fares a little bit more inflated if they possibly can. The next really significant piece of news is protocols for starting cruising in these regions which have lower infection rates are looking pretty consistent as we move ahead. Now, Royal Caribbean Group, Norwegian Cruise Line Group, they have formed a healthy sailing panel which is working on recommendations which will be ready at the end of August to start the discussion with the CDC on how they can start sailing, particularly out of US ports. But we're seeing real consistency as all the different cruise lines announce the protocols and start sailing. So we're seeing, for example, over 65s are often being suggested that they seek medical advice before traveling. There's no need for certificates. We're seeing reduced capacity, so fewer passengers on board. Round about 60 to 70% of passengers on board cruise ships. We're seeing a stronger pre-screening, so you pre-book embarkation, stronger pre-screening with questionnaires which have to be filled out online beforehand, temperature checks, and also the ability to have COVID-19 tests for passengers that are felt to be at risk in some ways. On board we're seeing structures which enable social or physical distancing, whichever you want to call it. So we're seeing a lot of controls on the amount of people allowed in any venues, around in swimming pools, around in theatres. We're seeing the amount of people who can go to things like kids clubs, various events all being controlled, very reduced numbers in those venues, even though there's fewer passengers on board. Lots of changes to dining, where we're seeing you have to pre-book dining in advance and you can only sit with members of your same household or traveling party. Again, distance 1.5 meters apart with tables. No self-service venues are operating. We're also seeing when it comes to excursions, a lot of the cruises that started up have no ports of call. So a lot of them are cruises to nowhere, or those that do have some ports are tending to call at very small ports, and again with very controlled excursions which are linked to and signed off and following the same protocols as the cruise line has on board. So for example, fewer passengers on board the bus, the use of masks in some cases. When it comes to masks on board, what we're seeing, the cruise lines are adopting whatever is the norm in that country. So because a lot of these cruises are cruising within one country, whether it's Germany or France or whatever, they're following both on board and when you head in port, whatever the mask rules are. So we are seeing in some regions the use of masks being part of the experience. Tend to be mostly where there are crowds coming together. Lots of additional cleaning, the introduction of things like HEPA filters through the air conditioning system, significant ramping up of the medical facilities on board, the ability to do more quarantining on board, and also very importantly, which is maybe also made easier because they are cruising only in one country, is a plan if there is an outbreak in terms of how people are dealt on board, how they go into the health system, and repatriation home. Again, because these ships are not moving across international waters, I guess it becomes much easier to develop those plans, and that could be another factor really strongly influencing why cruises as they start up are sticking within one country and staying within one healthcare and government system. Huge amounts of things happening in the cruise industry, constant flood and new information and changes coming. So every week I'll try and update you with one of these videos updating you on what the latest news is and what it could mean for you as a cruiser. So why don't you watch another video that I have within this cruising series, or just general video about cruising right now.